Welcome to an hour of Healthmade Radio. Healthmade is a community for natural health seekers where we educate people about common health conditions and share extensive research on the most effective natural health treatments and promote legislation that protects our health freedoms. Our core concept belief is in the innate intelligence and healing power of the body, and if properly supported spiritually, emotionally, and nutritionally, it can find its way back to health. Healthmade Radio will bring information from integrative health experts throughout the world. Check us out at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt, and I will be your host. Today's guest is Roman Bystrianyk. Roman Bystrianyk co-authored with Suzanne Humphreys the book Dissolving Illusions, Disease, Vaccine, and the Forgotten History. His latest soon-to-be-released book will be on major planetary environmental challenges we face. He has an extensive background in health and nutrition, a bachelor in engineering, and a master in computer science. Roman, I'm so excited to chat about this subject, especially with everything that's going on in the world right now. What I'm curious about, with your background in engineering, computer science, what led you into this direction? Why vaccines?
First, hi. How are you? Good?
I'm doing good, exactly.
Good. So I started out just being an average person. I didn't really have an interest in all this. My background's in engineering, computers. But I got into alternative medicine for probably a longer story than we have here. And at some point, I ran across some radio programs that were talking about issues with the vaccines, things like neurological damage and things of that nature, and autism. And I thought to myself at the time that that's horrible, but at least I knew vaccines got rid of all these horrible diseases that used to kill millions. So, on balance, maybe they could do better, but at least we had that, right? And I ran across a book that showed a chart that showed a 95% decline in mortality in measles before the vaccine was introduced. And I just sat there and looked at it, and I said, well, that can't be true. This author has probably just made it up to sell books, or maybe he's crazy. But I went to a local library and I found an almanac, and they had some data every 10 years. And I took out my little graph paper. I'm dating myself because this was quite a few years ago. And I charted it, and I just sat there looking at it. I was like, wow, that seems to be true. And that propelled me to go get the actual, data from the vital health statistics in other locations. I kept on going, and I found out that was actually very true. It was just totally shocking to me, and made me realize that the belief I had had to be wrong. The data showed something completely different. So it propelled me into, reading a lot more history and finding out what did cause the decline in disease. It wasn't the vaccines. It wasn't major medical interventions. And so I was just, really very, very curious. And I just kept on digging and digging. And, I really wanted to do the best for my kids. And, that was really the motivation more than anything else.
And so, because the common consensus is obviously that the vaccines cured the measles, cured polio, whooping cough. But are you saying that the vaccine really didn't have much impact in stopping these diseases?
Yeah, so when you look at the data, for example, measles mortality declined by about 98% before they introduced the vaccine. The mortality curve really wasn't affected much. In England, they started gathering data in 1838, and it really started declining in the mid to late 1800s. And by the time they started using the vaccine in 1968, you already had a 99.9% decline in mortality. And that's just for measles. Something similar for whooping cough in the U.S. The U.S. started gathering statistics in 1900, whereas England started in 1838. They were far ahead. So from 1900 to 1963, when they started vaccinating, you had 98%, we're talking about whooping cough, 1940s, it had gone down by 92%. In England, because they started gathering data earlier, you had about a 99% decline in whooping cough deaths before any vaccination program. And this is hard data. It's not in dispute. So, and similar for other things. Scarlet fever, which is a bigger killer, went from big killer to zero without any vaccine. Well, there was a vaccine, but it wasn't really widely used because it was so toxic. So all these diseases, interestingly, declined all at the same time. And that's really key, because that's what really, pointed me in the direction that something significant changed overall. And it wasn't any kind of medical intervention. Antibiotics came in much later, so that wasn't really a big factor. So you had all these other things going on that were the really major reason these diseases went away, or they were still there. They just weren't much of a threat, including smallpox, by the way.
Okay, yeah, because these diseases, like measles, that was kind of ravaging through Europe and then here in the United States as well during the 1800s. That was a big killer.
Sure. If you read the old literature, so 1700s, 1800s, measles was a big killer. Scarlet fever was a big killer. So was diphtheria. So was whooping cough. Smallpox throughout the 1800s and before was a big killer. Pneumonia, consumption, and the flu, all these things were killing people all the time. There was basically epidemics going on all the time. And then it just was a life of, avoiding death from infectious diseases, including cholera. There was major cholera pandemics from the early 1800s to the early 1900s.
So I'm curious then, why do you think it was so bad then and not so bad now? And if the vaccine was not the solution, what was the solution?
Yeah, again, there were certain diseases that went down before any vaccine, including the flu, by the way, which went down by 90% before they started vaccinating in 1970, which, by the way, didn't improve with vaccination. It stayed basically the same. So, since you have all these things declining at the same time, and you go read about how life was in the 1800s, it wasn't just people twirling parasols and people with top hats and coaches and all that wonderful stuff you see in movies. It was brutal. There was no sanitation. There was no hygiene. No one had a concept of, washing your hands. They thought that was pretty silly. Even the medical profession wouldn't do it, despite certain doctors saying we should do this. But the new profession of male midwives, which was replacing midwives, refused to wash their hands, and they killed lots of people with puerperal fever because they would go from a cadaver right to a delivery. And so you had all these infections going all over the place because you went to the bathroom, it went out the window, and it went right into your water supply. So it was, a horrific kind of situation, especially in the cities. Cities were just really overrun. There were also vermin. There were also very poor nutrition. People were often starving, or they were eating just super low-quality food. Scurvy was all over the place, massive vitamin C deficiency. So you have all these things going on. Labor was horrible. Children were working in mines or factories, and even when they were sick, so, they couldn't do too well. No one could do very well at all. So it didn't really, medicines didn't do anything. The smallpox vaccine didn't really do anything either. There were periodic epidemics, even though that was, came up with the notion in 1798 or 1796. And so you had this horrible environment where people were overworked, children were working, there was poor quality food, sanitation's horrifying, no hygiene. It just, you just couldn't be healthy. It was impossible. So everybody's immune systems were completely compromised. So yeah, any kind of microbe that would come along, you would be in trouble. You would get sick. You would be weak, and then oftentimes you would die. And these things are spreading all over the place, all the time.
And so in reality, like you were saying, I mean, the fascinating thing was that all of these different epidemics, tended to die down. All these infectious diseases reduced dramatically at around the same time. So
yeah, starting. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the factors that you were then discussing, I mean, it seems like as we got better with those factors, did that then correlate with the infectious diseases being less prevalent?
Right. So yeah, mid to late 1800s, there was a big movement by lots of different people to clean up cities because there was a notion that living like in this horrible condition is just not good for everybody. So they would, over a series of decades, put in water supplies, cleaned up, have sanitation, proper sanitation. People used to live in abysmal housing and sometimes in cellars, in these dark, vermin-infested cellars, and where they would get very little light and, be overrun with all sorts of creatures. And, they suffered horribly. So those things were closed down. Better housing was slowly implemented. Electricity came in. So then at first you would have ice boxes and then eventually refrigerators. People realized the water supply was polluted, so they instituted all sorts of different things in there, chlorination. The food supply improved. People would sell milk that was adulterated with all sorts of chemicals, including formaldehyde. They stopped that practice. And so everything got extremely good by the 1940s and 1950s. And of course, by that time, diseases were just not a major consideration. And you can read about that in the 1940s, 1950s medical journals. They were saying, well, we don't really have to worry about infectious disease deaths. They're just not a big problem. They're not a major factor of death, when only decades earlier they were. And it's really hard to imagine, even, in the 1970s, to imagine how life was so brutal back then that, it just kind of blows your mind. But it was very, very difficult. People died of old age within, by the time they were 30, 40, 50, if they lived that long. And they were often very debilitated because of poor nutrition, overwork, and these horrible conditions. You meant 1870s or 1970s for that? 1970s. I'm saying when you imagine in 1970, and that's kind of when I was growing up, I couldn't even imagine back then, and I'm sure nobody could that was around in 1970s to think back to the 1800s or even know about the 1800s, how bad it was.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the living conditions and like you're saying, it was all based upon survival at that time. So then you would send your children would work. You would try to figure out a way to make enough money to buy some kind of food, because malnutrition and housing obviously were not ideal in any shape or form.
Sure. There was no schooling. Kids actually protested to get into some kind of school back in the 1800s. Certainly better than working in the mines or factories. In factories, they were just under the supervision of some taskmaster, and they were often abused and had to work 12 hours a day. So schooling, as it slowly came in, and labor laws and child labor laws all came in as well to improve the situation. Women had it really rough. A lot of women had to work. They worked in these factories. They often had to turn to prostitution to survive. It was it wasn't like the movies when you watch mainstream movies or which I enjoy movies, but they're not really real. They're just kind of a fantasy of the rich. But besides that, the average people had it really, really rough.
Yeah, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Healthmade Radio. I'm here with Roman Bystrianyk. He is the co-author of Dissolving Illusions. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Healthmade Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Roman Bystrianyk. He is the co-author of Dissolving Illusions, and the illusion we are talking about is vaccines being the tool to turn these different infectious diseases around in the mid 1900s and late 1900s. So with all of this going on, I mean, for us now, it seems so obvious that obviously if you don't wash your hands, you're going to be carrying infections. But at that time, it wasn't. In fact, the doctor that was lobbying for that people delivering babies should wash your hands. He almost lost his license, for doing that. He almost got ostracized for doing that. But, for us now, it seems so obvious, so we try to look through the lens of our understanding now onto what was going on at that time. So, I mean, it seems so crazy. So just that alone, obviously, should turn things around.
Yeah, I mean, there was Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes and Dr. Semmelweis. They were pushing for that because the midwives at the time knew how to handle babies, and I guess they must have washed their hands or done something correctly. But when the male midwives, as they were called, the medical men came in, they just didn't think that was important. And so they would go from autopsies or whatever they're doing right to delivery, without taking any precautions. And, that's just what they thought was true, and they ended up killing lots of women that way, and babies. They infected them during the delivery. So, postpartum was, disaster. So, not to mention, everybody's malnourished. Some people almost never had a vegetable or fruit. Now we take it for granted. You just go to the store and you can get apples or whatever you want. But back then, no, you just had, whatever you could find, basically. And sometimes the food was rotten meat, rotten fish. Everything was not high quality. So, those are another thing. That's other things that improved as well.
Yeah, because we did have, obviously, fridges and freezers, and then, being in the middle of the city, we didn't have access to farmland. So,
right.
Didn't have the stores where, things weren't kept.
Yeah, they would bring the animals in and slaughter them in the city near buildings that people lived, the poor buildings where people lived, the tenements. And, people would have to listen to these animals being slaughtered. And, of course, their refuse and the blood all trickle down into the water supply, as well as other industries like tanneries, et cetera, that would just, all the stuff went right in the water. And so people were drinking this. I mean, they had no choice. And I can't even imagine what that, how you would even drink that. And there were people commenting about this in the 1800s, how, the poor treated so horribly. And that was a good majority of the population. And, of course, they were extremely ill all the time. And, there was really no medication or anything that would ever do anything about it because it was so abysmal.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you don't have nutrition and you are continually exposed, heavily exposed to these very infectious agents, and also live in a toxic world with a huge amount of stress, I mean, it's amazing they survived as long as they did.
Yeah, well, some of them didn't live that long. Children died frequently in childhood, right? And then even if you got past that, you were oftentimes crippled and not doing well, and you didn't make it to, much older than 20, 30, or 40, unless you were wealthy. The wealthy or the well-off were doing pretty well. But even then, they were subject to the same conditions that they had to somehow overcome. So it just was not a pretty time to live. No. Despite what you might see in, movies, it was extremely rough.
Yeah. Well, let's take a quick break. You're listening to Healthmade Radio. I'm here with Roman Bystrianyk. He is the co-author of Dissolving Illusions. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Healthmade Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Roman Bystrianyk. He is the co-author of Dissolving Illusions, and we're talking about vaccines as being the illusion that we all thought saved the world from all these different infectious agents, when in reality the history shows something completely different. So I'm curious with all these things going on, and tell me a little bit about the the history of vaccine. How did it all start? I mean, was it very kind of a scientific study group that started to develop this? Was it all done under very research quality facilities of the time, or how did all of this start?
Yeah, so I would say the science at the time was beyond primitive and doesn't meet any kind of standard at all, really. It really began in the 1700s with the idea that if we took, everything started with smallpox, that was the idea. If we took a little bit of smallpox and scratched it onto you, you would get smallpox. And that way you could get through it because it's under controlled circumstances. So you would get that, scratch on your arm, you would get the smallpox, and they would basically treat you until you got better, which kind of makes sense for just giving somebody smallpox before they get it when they're not ready for it. And so this would actually work, but there were obvious problems because, well, it could kill you or start an epidemic. So they always thought, there's a desire to think of something less dangerous. And again, this was a standard medical practice for quite a while. But then a man by the name of Edward Jenner decided that he had heard rumors that people who were milking cows who got cowpox were immune to smallpox. And he believed those stories, so he decided to perform an experiment where he took diseased matter from a cow's udders, or actually it was actually from the hands of a dairymaid, and scratched it onto a boy. Later, the boy was deliberately exposed to smallpox, and he didn't come down with smallpox. Now, it sounds like a horrible experiment, but that's what they were doing to prevent smallpox. They were doing variolation, which is scratching the smallpox onto your skin. So he did that procedure, and, he didn't come down with smallpox. So at that point, Jenner pretty much claimed that he had discovered lifelong protection against smallpox. He published a paper in 1798 on the discovery, and very interestingly, the idea of being protected for life with cowpox was pretty rapidly adopted by the medical profession, and it became a source of income. They realized that, we figured out how to conquer smallpox, and, the problem was solved. But it really, really wasn't. That was just simply something that was embraced by the medical profession at the time. But very early on, there was problems that they found, or various people wrote about, and it just never dissuaded the medical profession from this idea of vaccination. And vaccination comes from the word vaca, which is cow, and that's where that term comes from, vaccination. And, so when you talk about the science, Jenner's claim was pretty amazing considering the small number of cases he had. Many people would have gotten this variolation, the smallpox, and were probably immune to smallpox if they had gotten that. He didn't think about subclinical cases. That wouldn't have been something he thought of. There was really no scientific method. There wasn't any control group. And he just came up with this, idea that you were protected from smallpox, and more extraordinarily, he thought it was lifelong protection, which, of course, there's no way he would be able to say that, but that's something he believed.
So it's almost like the medical profession just kind of followed along with these assumptions, because obviously it's a very sexy theory. I hear you're having something, and you say, now you're going to be lifelong protected, and it became a financial, financial.
Yeah, there was a financial incentive, but not everybody, thought this was a great idea. There was a Dr. Walter Hodwin, MD, and he knew many cow doctors that knew of hundreds of cases of smallpox that followed people that had cowpox. So right from the beginning, people said, hey, that's not really true, because people with cowpox, still ended up with smallpox. So right from the beginning, there was, questioning of the whole, notion. And it wasn't just straightforward, like, oftentimes when I read the various medical texts or even kids' books, it pretty much ends with Jenner discovering this vaccination, and we're done, and we were saved. But there's a lot more to the story. Initially, because people weren't really too thrilled with getting, pus from a cow and having scratched onto their arms, Jenner developed something called humanized cowpox vaccine. So you still took pus from an animal and scratched it onto a person. The vaccination procedure then consisted of taking pus from that pock of an inoculated human and putting it into a cut arm of another person. It was called arm-to-arm vaccination. Another way you could do it, you could take those scabs from that person and put it in a jar, fill it with water and shake, and then you could use the pus water mixture and vaccinate a whole town with that. But obviously there's a problem with that, because you're going to be transferring other diseases that, from arm to arm. But arm-to-arm vaccination was very common, and it was used for the next 100 years until it was outlawed in 1898. And, again, you got to keep in mind things were very unhygienic. So we had lots of people dying from infections because they just didn't know anything about hygiene.
So what would be the effect of that arm? I mean, here you're cutting, you're having a cut of the arm, and then you're putting infectious material into that arm. I mean,
right.
What would commonly happen with that arm? I mean, I would assume that would just kind of blow up in infection.
Well, they would get infections. If everything well, you would get these big, huge sores on your arm, which they would call a good arm, because if you didn't have any reaction, they considered that bad, which means, the vaccine didn't take. But if you had these citrixes that would just kind of form, and, basically it varied depending on the time frame, but, maybe it was 2, 3, 4, or 5, and it would look pretty nasty. And sometimes it would get out of control, and the person might even lose an arm or die. So it wasn't like an easy procedure, but this is what they were doing. And it ended up not being just so straightforward as cowpox, because Jenner actually thought this kind of vaccine material came from horses, from a condition called the grease, which were these open sores on horses' legs. He was convinced that that's where it came from. And then over time, other animals were used. There were mules, rabbits, and goats. Despite it being called vaccination, it was actually, came from many different types of animals. And doctors actually debated about it. They said, well, does it come from a horse? Does it come from a cow? And some people thought it was smallpox that you would put on a cow's udder, and it would transform it into cowpox. So they thought that the cow somehow, through its own body, would transform it to this less lethal cowpox. So you had all these different theories. Nobody really understood anything about microbiology or anything like that. They were just trying these experiments. So really, depending on the source of your material, you would get a mix of microbes of one or another, including even maybe sometimes smallpox. So vaccinations were really a bunch of different concoctions. And then actually in 2011, in the Journal of Virology, scientists actually looked at the dry-vax smallpox vaccine, which is the last one that was around for a long time, and they found it to be of human and horse origin. And then they found that there was a whole bunch of different viruses in there, and that they had only isolated a small number of viruses. So the smallpox vaccine was really a jumble of different pathogens, and it was just called cowpox. But it's hard to imagine that something that has all these different microbes of different amounts and different origins ever really did anything against smallpox.
And so you're saying 2011. So are you saying that was the vaccine that was used in 2011?
No, that's when scientists were looking at the dry vax.
Okay.
So when they looked at the analysis of it, and they found all these different kinds of microbes in there. So it wasn't just this one cowpox virus. It was an assortment of different, what they call quasi-species. So there was a bunch of different things in there, which you would expect if they were going from goats and rabbits and humans and back again. You've created this concoction over time of different pathogens.
Yeah, and so how? Actually, let's take another quick break because I want to make sure that we can finish the next segment because I want to talk a little bit about the compulsory vaccines at that time and the impact that had and how effective that was. So we'll take a quick break. You're listening to Healthmade Radio. I'm here with Roman Bystrianyk. He is the co-author of Dissolving Illusions along with Suzanne Humphreys. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Healthmade Radio. I'm here with Roman Bystrianyk. He is the co-author of Dissolving Illusions, Disease, Vaccines, and the Forgotten History, along with Suzanne Humphreys. So here they have all these different assumptions in regards to what this vaccine is doing. They weren't really, if you looked at it scientifically, the assumption didn't really hold true in any shape or form. But still, they pushed these different vaccines to the level of that people were forced to get them. It was, it was mandatory at that time. And
right, that came a little later in the mid-1800s.
Okay.
For that. But, even early on, I just have to point out, like in 1799, the year after he published his paper, Dr. Drake got material right from Dr. Jenner and vaccinated 3 children. He waited the appropriate time and then scratched smallpox onto them, like that's what they were doing. And they all developed smallpox. So the vaccine didn't work right out of the gate. And there's reports all through the medical literature in the early 1800s of children who were vaccinated and later died of smallpox. Or it's an 1810 article, 500 cases of smallpox, 100 fatal cases, 150 cases of vaccine injuries. And there's a series of different articles throughout history, early 1800 history, that shows that the vaccine was not working properly. Dr. Thomas Brown, who was very enthusiastic in 1818 about vaccination, after he did a bunch of vaccinations, found that, after vaccinating about 1,000 people, he could no longer support the practice because people were getting smallpox. And this gentleman, William Corbett, a journalist and an English pamphleteer, noted that hundreds of instances where people were vaccinated by Jenner himself had gotten smallpox afterwards and either almost died or died. So, and you can read in the newspapers reports of deaths from smallpox in properly vaccinated children. So this was going on right from the beginning. People would get skin conditions called erysipelas that would spread all over your body and was an extremely painful way to die. So it wasn't working, early on, but and I think as people realized that, they decided they didn't really want to do it. They started kind of pushing against it. And that's, when the medical profession / government decided, well, we have to start forcing people. And so they made vaccination compulsory in England in 1853, and then they passed stricter laws in 1867. But despite those laws, they still kept on having epidemics. They did something similar in Boston, which I thought was very interesting. In 1855, they passed very strict laws. No one could get out of vaccination. Everybody had to be vaccinated. But if you look at the data of mortality from smallpox, the 20 years before the 1855 law and the 20 years after, more people died after the law than they did before. So there was no effect. As a matter of fact, it got worse, which, you can kind of imagine why that might be if there's all sorts of different ways these things are being made and then scratched onto people's arms. How is that going to actually protect you and maybe even give you smallpox if they were scratching smallpox onto the udders of cows and trying to make, vaccine material? It's really hard to find out how any particular batch of, vaccine was made at any particular time because, people are doing it in all sorts of different ways. So who knows? But certainly it wasn't, all done just directly from cows, even if that, could possibly work, which doesn't seem like that was even feasible.
And I'm curious, kind of jumping forward in history. So we have, obviously, wherever we're at, whatever age we're at, we always think that we have the best medical science, we have the best science, and we are so much smarter than we were at that time. But then looking at so at that time, people that got the vaccine, there's almost that more people were getting than infections because the vaccine was compulsory. I mean, you had to have the vaccine. And I think in your book you mentioned there was like a 110% vaccine rate. So everybody got vaccinated, if not at least twice.
Right. Yeah. The initial, I'm sorry if I'm interrupting your question. The initial idea of lifelong immunity did fade, and then doctors realized, well, it's not going to be lifelong. So they decided that instead of stopping the practice, they decided they had to be revaccinated, and the time frames varied between 10 years and every year, or even more frequently. The more, the better was their notion that, gee, well, if it's not lifelong, then we have to revaccinate, and so revaccination was really pushed quite often.
So so we had the huge decline then prior to vaccines even entering into the scene in these different infectious agents, and then vaccines then were introduced. Did the so-called modern vaccines, did they how did they do? I mean, did they protect an individual, or did it seem like people were getting the disease from that as well?
Those came much later. Those came in the early to late mid-1900s.
Yeah.
But the smallpox vaccine, just to kind of finish that off, there was a big outbreak. Actually, I think it was a pandemic in around 1871, 1872. And despite virtually 100% vaccination rates, there was widespread death. Right? Actually, millions were killed in Chicago, Boston, London, England, Germany, France, Prussia, all of the places where I could get data from. Everybody who was vaccinated, they died in huge numbers. So, it wasn't working, but the medical profession was absolutely fixed on vaccination as the solution. And I was always curious, what causes 1871, 1872 pandemic? And I actually don't have any proof about this, but it was a giant spike, and I have to wonder, with people scraping potentially smallpox onto cows or other animals and then injecting people. Actually, they weren't injecting; it's scraped on. It's not actually injected into the bloodstream. But you have to wonder: did all these people being vaccinated with these various concoctions didn't actually start all these epidemics in 1872?
Yeah,
but it would be very interesting to track down some kind of evidence of that, but I don't have any. But it was quite a widespread pandemic, and after that, people really lost their faith in vaccination. And in 1885, the people of Leicester, England, actually rose up and said, "Hey, we don't think we should be vaccinated. We should have our individual liberty to decide, well, one of my child died from vaccination. I'm not going to get another one." But the court was very strict, and they were throwing people in jail. They were fining people if they couldn't pay the fine, and people had enough. And so there was a big protest, and they eventually elected a new government in their town, and which didn't require the vaccination. And they came up with their own method called the Leicester method, which was just quarantining smallpox and instituting, clean streets and sanitation. And if somebody was sick, they would take them off to the smallpox hospital and disinfect their homes, which I'm not really sure how they went about doing that, but they did that kind of thing. And the medical men of the time, they said, "Hey, you're being, this is a brave thing to do, but you're being really stupid." They thought this was a gigantic experiment that would result in a terrible massacre, especially the unprotected children. They thought these people were being fools, and they were all going to come, begging for, Jenner's wonderful invention. But over the years, Leicester always did better than towns that were highly vaccinated. And by 1948, so that's 60 years, where they didn't have high vaccination rates, they were around 10%. There was never really any problem. They never had a problem with smallpox. So over 40 years, from 1908 to 1948, there was only 2 deaths from smallpox. So that's a very tiny amount compared to, the time frame and the size of the city. And so nothing bad ever happened when they stopped vaccinating. And across England, actually, after 1872, vaccination coverage has dropped. And the medical people were quite upset by this and thought, gee, there's going to be eventually a resurgence of smallpox, and, everyone's going to suffer because of it. And that never happened. As a matter of fact, after 1897, the severe smallpox basically changed. It used to kill 1 in 5 people, and then in short order, it was only killing 1 in 50, and then 1 in 380. And then by the early 1900s, it was often confused with chickenpox. It just became a non-issue. It just faded away as a serious cause of death, which, when this in the various medical journals, I was quite surprised. I had never heard of that. So, smallpox, like all these other, actually smallpox faded away quicker, but like these other infectious diseases became a non-issue to the population in general. And you can even read in the 1922 Journal of the Missouri State Medical Association that that the mild type of smallpox had replaced the severe kind in the entire United States, Brazil, and even most of Africa. It just became it wasn't like a deadly pathogen anymore.
Yeah, and it's almost, if you look back on history and the patterns that were taking place, you can almost transpose those patterns on today's world, and they look the same. It's like we're not learning from history in regards to the patterns we were dealing with then, and now we're trying to do the same kind of pattern where we're trying to force something that doesn't seem to have really been proven. It seems to be proven as well as it did at that time.
Yeah, to me, the biggest problem with vaccination is they've convinced themselves and the public that vaccination is the solution to every infectious disease, when it wasn't really the solution in the first place. They've created a myth around the smallpox vaccine that isn't warranted. It didn't work, and it was deadly often, and it caused a lot of suffering. There's horrible stories you can read about in various newspapers about children getting a vaccine and dying horribly or suffering horribly, and none of that is acknowledged. It's basically just this kind of fantasy of Jenner, solving the problem, and now we have that idea, and then we can work with it, and it's just a false history, and I think it's just been whitewashed. In the late 1800s, Dr. Charles Crichton wrote a very interesting article in the Encyclopedia Britannica, very critical of vaccination, of the origins, of the effects of various diseases caused by it. And it was there until 1921 or so when that article was removed and was replaced with vaccine therapy. And in that article, they talk about how, very briefly, how Edward Jenner had invented the vaccine, and that the vaccine gave you immunity, and if it didn't, and you got smallpox, it would be more mild. So the reality that had been written was stripped away and replaced with vaccine therapy as the new reality, which was a false reality. So someone or some group decided, hey, they wanted to promote vaccines as a therapy, as a medical therapy, and so they removed history from the Encyclopedia Britannica, which probably was a main source of information for the layperson at the time. It's not like now we have the internet, and so they just whitewashed history. It's like, well, we don't want to talk about that. Let's get rid of that because we want to make more vaccine therapies. And so, over time, you create this mythology of vaccines. And today, if you don't support vaccines, you get called a name, because that's how people behave. When I was growing up as a kid, I thought when you're an adult, you don't call people names, but unfortunately in our society, that's what people do. And so you can call someone an anti-vaxxer, which is supposed to, be an insult. And instead of actually listening to the person who's not interested in getting a vaccine and why they don't want to get it, people will name call. Even in newspapers or on TV, they use these childish names. And I find it quite embarrassing that people, resort to name calling instead of actually having discussions about things. But that's what people do, unfortunately. But, bottom line is the history was completely distorted. And, even when I was growing up, I don't know how I knew it, but I knew vaccines were the greatest invention ever. That's what Suzanne Humphreys thought. Lots of doctors that I knew thought that until you actually went and looked at the history. And then it's not what we thought it was.
Yeah, exactly. And I just want to get back to the point, where the measles or the chickenpox, people were become inoculated, and they were you think that probably is what's crossed these different pandemics at the time, epidemics at the time. And are you seeing, are there same patterns now, or is it that the people that get vaccinated nowadays and they are protected, or is it possible that they get the disease themselves as well?
Well, now is a completely different thing compared to smallpox vaccine, which was, this horrible concoction of different things with no hygiene scratched onto your arm. So that's a completely different story. I think my main point is when you have a mortality decline of in England and U.S. and France, I have these data sets. For example, measles. If you have like almost 100% decline in mortality, why are you doing this? You may decrease the incidence of measles to some degree, which there seems to be evidence for that, right? But really, is it really that important when such a low mortality rate? I don't remember the exact figures, but in France, when they very early on, their odds of dying from measles was about 3 times more than being hit by lightning and getting killed. It just was such a rare event, but we've gotten so used to it, every time there's a measles outbreak, we think everyone's going to die. Measles is not a serious illness for the most part in healthy people. And it wasn't even in the 1950s. There were articles written in the 1950s saying how measles was just not a big deal and that most children just recovered just fine. And so, it just brings up the question, why are we doing this? In 1967, when they started, they started in 63, but articles in 1967 claimed they were going to wipe out measles off the face of, at least America by the end of 1967. Well, that didn't work. And they promised lifelong protection. Well, that didn't work. And then they decided, well, the early vaccines weren't any good, so anyone before 1980 had to get revaccinated. And then it's like, oh, wait, we need to do 2 vaccines, and everybody has to do it all the time. And as a matter of fact, you can't even get into school now because if you don't get your vaccines. And so it's always been a creeping escalation of you have to do more and more and more. And again, I think the biggest damage is that people are convinced that without vaccines, we're all going to die of all sorts of diseases. And that's just simply not the case. And because we went down that path, we didn't learn that what really makes the difference in health is free. It's good, clean water. It's healthy food. Well, it's not exactly free, but pretty free. Healthy food, a nice place to live, not being overworked, and having a nice day. That's 99.9% of health. And instead, we've created this whole complex of, medications and vaccines and everything else to, keep us going and help us and protect us. And I think it's a giant disaster. What's really interesting also from 1877 all the way up to 1911, I think it was, different doctors talked about something called apple cider vinegar. And they were using apple cider vinegar to completely stop smallpox. It was completely protective. So you would just have to take 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar 2 times a day or 3 times a day, depending on the doctor. And these doctors claimed you were immune to smallpox. So something as simple as apple cider vinegar was very protective. We didn't go that route, I think, because it's a relatively cheap, free solution to something.
Or how about you're talking about vitamin A? Like cod liver oil. Would
right.
be
for measles, right? So vitamin A, vitamin C were critical, and all you had to do is increase vitamin C. Dr. Klenner was doing that in the 50s in measles and other conditions, and he got amazing results. People would get through measles in like 2 days without any issue, and then they would be fine. So I think we went completely the wrong direction because we decided to medicalize everything. And I think Suzanne wrote this little piece in the book, which I thought was kind of interesting. Let's see, here it is. Apple cider vinegar might seem silly, but only because most people have been conditioned to accept the age-old prophylaxis of smallpox, raw, disease-laden, contaminated pus scrapings from an infected animal, usually a cow, belly, diluted with glycerin and scratched into the human arm with a metal prong until the arm was raw and bleeding. What seems sillier now? So
exactly.
It's whatever you're conditioned to think, right? And we were conditioned to think this was the way to do it. And because in my opinion is because there was a profit motive and, people could, make money and create some kind of self-esteem for them, instead of teaching the people about good hygiene, good food, plenty of sunshine and fresh air, having a nice day, not having been overworked and stressed, and do simple things like apple cider vinegar and make sure you have enough vitamin A and vitamin C, and then you're 99% of the way there.
Yeah, I mean, the survival of a profession is obviously the people's dependence on it. So if there are simple solutions out there that will minimize that dependence, and then you have to refocus people on solutions that make them dependent.
Yeah, and again, if you look at improving your immune system and really getting healthy, then suddenly you're not going to have a problem with all pathogens, right? And all these microbes, you're just going to have a better response to everything. If you're already weak, then you're going to have problems with all the same pathogens. You're going to come across them and get sick or die. But generally, like again with the measles, by 1950, almost nobody was dying from measles. Sure, people were dying, but very few compared to what they were in the 1800s.
Yeah. Well,
instead of taking the solutions that we knew, or some people knew about vitamin A, vitamin C, good diet, et cetera, we created a whole new way to do things to solve the last 0.1% of the problem, which, I think is just pure insanity. I mean, you could be doing these other things and having spectacular results, but again, who's going to promote those things in our society too, which is all profit driven?
Yeah, and use fear to drive that profit. Roman, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show, and this book is fascinating, Dissolving Illusions, and it really it is important to be reminded of history, because if you don't know history, then you keep reliving it, and it seems like we are in that pattern right now. So I strongly urge everyone to get this book, Dissolving Illusions, and really learn what was going on. So thank you so much, Roman. I really appreciate this.
Thanks for the chance to talk.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it. Have a great day.
You too. You as well. That is it for today. You're listening to Healthmade Radio. Remember, check us out at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it.